Good afternoon, everybody. This is Joe McGonigal from DVS Match in the Philadelphia, New Jersey, and Delaware markets. And I'm really happy to have a couple of our key partners to do a little bit of just an overview of what's happening in the marketplace as it relates to dental transitions. We are at the mid to late April at this stage, so you've probably seen plenty of webinars and plenty of calls like this, kind of talking about the market, whether it's PPP and SBA loans or any other aspect of the dental market. And we wanted to spend a little bit of time today. We are going to try to keep this relatively brief to talk to specifically to doctors, both practice owners and those doctors looking to acquire or buy practices, just to kind of set the stage for what we see happening right now, but more importantly, how to think about moving forward with your plans. And essentially, doing a practice transition is a complex and an important process in the best of times. And with everything we're facing now, it's certainly a bit different. And I think there's some general anxiety around what does it all mean? And more importantly, what's it going to mean for you? I think essentially doctors break down into two categories here. We have clients that were really close to the closing table, had a signed LOI and we're negotiating the definitive agreement, an asset purchase agreement, an employment agreement, and then things kind of paused. And so those clients are asking, what happens now? What happens to the value of my practice? What happens to my closing? And how do I move forward from here when things reopen? And there's also doctors out there who were planning to transition their practice in 2020 or early 2021 in the next 18 months or so. And maybe you had your practice valued already, and maybe you were just starting the process, but didn't really have any offers coming in. Or maybe your plan was to do this in the second part of the year. And again, I think a lot of the questions are around, what does this mean for my practice value? Should I still be doing this? And if so, what is the best way to proceed? And so I invited a couple of key partners for us. So Bill Coates is my partner. And we do practice transitions exclusively. We only represent practice owners and sellers, but I invited two people that we rely on a lot. The first is Matt Howard from Blue & Company. Matt's going to tell you about his credentials and what he does, but Matt does the practice valuation, the business valuations for all of our clients. He is an independent third party to DVS Match, but Matt is a key resource for us. And so in a moment here, I'll let Matt introduce himself. And we also have Bill Kalogredis with us. And Bill is an attorney who specializes in dental and medical transactions like this. He's represented our clients in many occasions, and we really trust Bill's advice and guidance as well. And I think Bill's going to talk a little bit about the contractual aspect of how this is going to transpire and what both buyers and sellers should consider from a transactional standpoint, with what we've been faced with. So Matt, I'll toss it to you. Maybe you can do a brief intro and then we'll have Bill do the same.
Thanks, Joe. Glad to be on. And my name is Matt Howard. I'm a CPA. I don't do the traditional tax work that probably your CPA is working on right now, or the bookkeeping or anything like that. I work specifically on transactions and have several certifications basically in valuation. I'm a certified valuation analyst and an accredited business valuator. So both of those basically just tell the story that I work on transactions. I work on specifically right around 200 to 300 dental valuations a year. So I'm very segmented in dental and spend almost all of my time on the dental transaction world today. Blue is a top 60 CPA firm. We've got about over 10 offices and hundreds of professionals dedicated to healthcare. And I specifically, again, focus on the dental world.
Great. Thanks for taking some time out to join us, Matt. And Bill, how about you? Tell us a little bit about you and your firm.
Thank you, Joe. My name is Bill Kalogredis, and I'm a healthcare attorney, and I've been practicing for over 40 years, 100% medical dental, physicians and dentists as individuals and their practices. And a big part of it relates to buying and selling and merging and other transitional type planning matters that relate to medical and dental practitioners and their practices and related entities. The firm I work with is called Lamb Macro Lane, It's in suburban Philadelphia. It's a law firm with approximately 40 attorneys. I'm the head of the health law department there. I 100% do the medical dental work and look forward very much to participating today with the esteemed panel. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Bill. So, guys, maybe what we could do is, again, segment this into two types of probably dentists as they're showing up to this transitions world. I just got off the call with a client that I'm working with and representing in the sale of his practice. We were scheduled to close on March 27th, which was like almost instantly when everything kind of got paused. So obviously that didn't happen. Everything was fully negotiated. So the APA was fully negotiated, the employment agreement fully negotiated, everything. We were ready to close, and now we're not. So buyers still very much, I'm full steam ahead. Let's just wait till things get open. But I got a call from the buyer this week and saying, hey, a couple questions. What if we have to buy or invest in additional equipment and or PPE to be in compliance? There may be some different regulations. Is the seller willing to negotiate how that would be purchased and whose responsibility that is? So pretty fair question. And secondly, the buyer said, is the seller open to potentially renegotiating the price? And I think that sets up kind of the big question, and Matt, a big reason why I asked you to be here is, what about the value of my practice? So I had it valued, or I was under agreement to sell it at a certain price. How should I think about that number, during this process or coming out of it?
Yeah, and a great question. And anybody that says with absolute certainty that they know exactly how this is going to impact valuations is probably lying to you. So to say that I have all the answers today is probably me being tone deaf. But let me say in general, I started approaching this crisis taking a look at all the practices around the United States are shutting down, almost all around the same time. And so I was kind of looking at this as when a dentist gets sick and is out of the practice for a month or two, and obviously no dentistry is getting done, but typically that dentistry isn't leaving the practice, it's just kind of getting pushed out, or at least in general, it's not leaving the practice, it's getting pushed out. However, as this thing shows how much of a disruption it's going to be, and as the weeks have gone on a little bit, again, I don't want to be tone deaf to say that it's not going to impact valuations. I think there's a lot of things that need to be fully understood, starting with unemployment post COVID. Once we all get back to work, understanding how deep is the unemployment picture going to look from here on out. Because obviously if we have high unemployment based when looking back and not having barely any unemployment, that just takes patients out of the pool that could potentially be part of the practice. So that's one big key that we need to understand how many people go back to work. Obviously the 25 million as of the shooting of this video will decrease as businesses reopen. The question is how much will remain unemployed, because obviously that takes people out of the patient pool. Some of the other things are that will just basically help buyers and sellers understand where is the practice sitting, is what will monthly collections return to? Will they mimic what happened prior to COVID, or are they going to be significantly lower? I think those two things are one of the biggest keys to look at. And then obviously some of the smaller elements like PP&E costs, those have to increase. Even if production catches up, I think the volume of masks and gloves and all of those things will be increasingly used, especially as guidelines become more clear on exactly what to expect. So I wish I had perfect answers. I do think it will impact valuations. I don't really truly understand. I don't think anybody truly understands at what magnitude they will impact valuations yet.
So Matt, one of the things that I think is makes you a great resource is that in addition to valuing practices, your firm represents buyers of dental practices. You guys represent dentists who are acquiring practices. And so as a seller's representative, my clients and me feel like, oh, well, we don't want to change the price when we kind of agreed to this and we feel like everybody's going to come back and things will return. So, we don't really want to quickly say, let's start over and renegotiate everything. So as you're advising a buyer, if you were advising a buyer and everything had been agreed to, you were under LOI and things on track, how would you advise a buyer to proceed, knowing where we're at now? I ask that because I think it helps give sellers a little bit of clarity around, or practice owners around, what the buyer's advisors could be suggesting.
Yeah, great question. And the first thing I encourage buyers to keep perspective on is we are not buying a used car. Okay, we are buying a legacy. We are buying a seller's 30, 40 years of efforts to build what has become probably part of his family. He gets to see his buddies, or she gets to see her girlfriends come in twice or more a year. And it's part of who they have become over many years of practicing. So all I'm saying is buyers understand the emotional side of what's going on here. And so if you're looking to nickel and dime and negotiate $20,000 to $30,000 off, just understand the costs, the emotional costs that you're causing in the transaction. Is that, yes, if I was representing a buyer right now, I would say that everything is probably on the table. Just understanding that there has been a dramatic change, and at least until we come out and start collecting money again, and understanding the delta between what was life before and what was life after, I would say that there are avenues for negotiations. I will say that much. But I do want to reinforce what I was saying earlier, and that is, buyer, understand the cost of negotiating. When in the grand scheme of things, when we do get back to normal, $20,000 to $30,000 is a drop in the bucket. So to summarize, I do think that there has been enough disruption that we do need to have some open discussions. I'm not saying that everything has to go back to the drawing table. I'm just thinking that, good faith negotiation. Obviously, we've had a change. However, I don't think that we need to start all over again. I think that we just need to measure the change, understand the change some, and then get back to the table and have some good faith negotiations. Because if both parties want to get a deal done, we should be able to get it if we're both approaching this with good faith.
Mm-hmm. So, Bill Kalogredis, I'll toss it to you, because I feel like some of this is going to be managed and mitigated through the legal agreements and potentially even some contingencies. And we've talked about this a little bit. So maybe talk about contractually, and again, specifically talking about deals that were very close or largely fully negotiated. What's the expectation as we come back to the agreements and thinking about closing a transaction?
All right, if you're looking at the contractual side, the question is what's been signed, purely legal, looking at that.
Let's assume the LOI, obviously, and we have, largely fully negotiated but not signed definitive agreements.
Right. So if the LOI is signed, the question is, most LOIs are not, quote, legally binding per se. You have to look at what the language is, but it does pretty much say this is what we've agreed to, and we're now going to go to what they call the definitive agreements, the actual APA or asset purchase agreement, and post-sale employment or independent contractor agreement. So that's the legal side of it. What do those documents say? Are there outs built in? Are they not built in? Are there contingencies? Are there what they call material adverse impact type language is in a lot of APAs? And again, looking purely at the legal side, those things would have to be looked at. But I mirror what Matt said. I mean, big picturing it, because yes, I'm an attorney and this is what I do, but I also, as part of that, advise physicians and dentists, big picture as well. Fine, the contract says this, what is it you are willing to do, buyer or seller, because that could be on one or the other side, depending on the transaction. And big picture, do you really want this practice if you're the buyer? Do you really want to sell it if you're the seller? And if you get too pushy or too aggressive one way or the other, are there other potential people that could come in and take it instead? It's all a question of the market. What's going on in that particular market? Are there other potential buyers, for example, if you're the seller or the buyer, that could come and say, look, I'm going to spend that other 20 or 30,000 to buy the practice because I want to have it for the next 20, 30, 40 years. And on the seller side, is it the right person that I'm selling to? And am I willing to give up a few bucks? And when you talk about price and valuation, it's not just the price. You also have to look at how it's paid. And sometimes in some of these arrangements, we could say, look, I'm uncomfortable now paying X thousands of dollars or whatever for this practice today because I'm a little concerned. You think it's still worth that if you're the seller. I'm not saying it isn't, but I am concerned as the buyer. Maybe we can come up with something that some of it has to be earned out, so to speak. We'll commit to a minimum price and the rest would be earned over a 1, 2, or 3 year period based on revenues or net income or some agreed to formula. So again, these are practical things as far as that goes. So yes, we look at the contracts, we draft the contracts, we say this is what it says, it's ironclad or it isn't, it has loopholes or it doesn't. But bottom line is, what is it we're trying to accomplish here? If you're the buyer, I want to keep the seller happy because I don't like that seller to work with me for the next 1, 2, 3 years perhaps to help transition most effectively into the future to retain the practice and maintain everything I want to maintain, or not tick off the staff. If the staff is very loyal to the seller's doctor, the seller doctor, they're not going to be happy with the new person coming in or the new buyer if they feel that he or she or it, if it's a entity type buyer, is not treating the seller fairly in their eyes. So I can see with a lot of people saying, look, I'm concerned. And in some cases in the real world today, we're seeing some deferral, meaning, yes, we're going to do this, but why don't we settle 3 months from now or 6 months from now or some longer period of time than next week or next month, whatever it's available, just to see what transpires. But if we're going to do that, we have to make sure that at that point, at least if I'm on the buyer or seller side, actually, probably more the seller, that it is ironclad, that it's going to happen. And if not, perhaps there'll be penalties or something along those lines. The other way to sometimes accomplish it is, how is there going to be financing in place today that you thought you were going to have 2 months ago? And you folks can probably comment on that a lot, Joe and Bill Coates. But I know that some of the banks are so busy doing this other stuff, they may or may not be willing to fund as much as they did before because their folks may value the practice differently than they did a month ago. We don't know. So that becomes an issue. And that may or may not cause the need for some seller financing, maybe. I mean, so many different options. There's no one answer. That's what makes it fun, as an advisor to the docs out there today. And you folks are all in the same position. But try to say, what are you trying to accomplish? What are your goals? Let's see if we can come to a meeting of the minds that's reasonable and come up with a transaction that makes sense.
Yeah. I want to talk about the banking, but maybe separate that for a minute. But, one of the themes that's coming out here, and I think in general, what I'm hearing specific to the clients I'm working with, is that buyers want to be able to have some reasonable certainty or a mitigation plan in place about the revenue, right? If the revenue comes back, I'm happy to pay what we agreed to, right? We agreed to it. It was a good number 3 months ago. And if the revenue comes back, it's still a fair number, right? And so I think that there's probably a couple ways that sellers should probably just start to consider how that they can make and get a buyer comfortable if they don't want to renegotiate the selling price. One way is, that the seller, if they were scheduled to close, might have to be prepared to open the practice back up, operate it for a couple of months. Bill, as you just alluded to, right? Get something in place where I'll operate it, I'll bring it back, and we'll close this thing in 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, whatever that is. So it's essentially the seller's responsibility to get it back to protect the agreed upon purchase price or value of the practice. Mm-hmm. The other option is, again, you kind of alluded to it a little bit, is a contingency, right? So where, again, as the buyer, okay, I will pay you what we agreed upon. However, I need to hold a little bit of that back, and everybody can negotiate what a little bit is, but hold some of those proceeds back in escrow and tied to some sort of earnout or performance metric, again, just to ensure that the practice does, return to historical revenue levels.
Correct.
And so as a seller, you do, just because, there's risk to the buyer, maybe somebody wants to renegotiate something, you don't lose total control. Like, you still have options as a seller in terms of, how you accomplish both the continuing with the sale of the practice, but also, I think being reasonable and keeping everybody comfortable with the transaction overall.
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah. I guess let's talk about banking a little bit and just general buyer pools. I'll offer a couple of comments. We're getting a lot of calls from buyers. So Bill, and you can comment on this. I mean, Bill and I, we're partners. We've been inundated really with the last 2 weeks with calls from young docs who are, starting to weigh their options. I think one of those reasons is some of them are uncertain about what they're going back to as an associate potentially, and wherever they were an associate. So, if their plan was to start looking to buy a practice later this year or early next year, it feels like some of them are pulling that forward a little bit. And I think it's, again, being uncertain about what's in front of them, wherever they, were employed last. But I think that a lot of them realize there could be a lot more practices coming onto the market as a result of COVID. Now, Bill and I are not fear-based, and we are not in a position where we think, well, valuations and you should get your practice on the market. I don't believe that at all. I think you should sell your practice when you're ready and the timing's right for you. But I think that there's doctors in a certain age category that feel like they're higher risk for getting the virus and are a little unsure about heading back to work, especially if they have underlying health concerns. I know one of our colleagues got a call from a client who said his physician said he really shouldn't go back. Right. So I do think that there's going to be some more practices in the market. I think buyers realize that, and they think that from a valuation standpoint, there could be some good opportunities out there. So buyers are out there. I mean, they're having calls, they're talking to their advisors, and it feels like, what we're hearing from many of the major lenders is they're still looking at these deals and funding these deals. I mean, they're not going to fund a deal that's for a practice that's not open, right? So those closings have largely paused. But again, and you guys can all comment on this, I think the underlying fundamentals of the dental business from a lender's perspective are still really good. Dentists have a notoriously low default rate. And so I think that the banks who do this on a regular basis are still in this game. But, Bill, you mentioned it, there might be some components of sellers taking back a piece of that note or holding a piece of that note. So that could look a little bit different, but fundamentally, I think that there's still capital to do these for qualified buyers. So I don't see any impact there. Bill Coates, I mean, you've been talking to both, doctors thinking about, is this the time to do it, and buyers. Are you hearing the same sentiment out there?
Yeah, Joe, this business, it does have an ebb and flow to it. And right now, obviously, the calls have, certainly increased. And I'm seeing it on both sides, from the buyers and the sellers. And really my messaging has been to both parties. We represent sellers, but right now they really want to be in this asset protection mode. I mean, that's the goodwill, it's the patient relationship, it's communicating with, what you built all these years. And then, certainly from the buyers, with the pent up demand that's out there, potentially, it's speculating at some point, but, the baby boomers and what COVID and everything, the message is build your team, make sure you have someone like Matt Howard or Bill Kalogredis on your side that can help walk you through evaluation or look at some legal documents and help draft some things. So when the time is right. So, but yes, we're seeing some increase on my end as well.
Yeah. Guys, jump in wherever you want, but I think switching gears a little bit, let's talk about the doctor who, in January, February this year, they came out of the holidays, had a great 2019. They said, 2020 is my year. I am going to go through I'm going to start the process. I'm ready. And then March 15th or whatever hits. And now I think a lot of those doctors are wondering, well, now what? So Matt, I think we covered the valuation piece. You're going to get it valued. And we're not 100% sure what that impact's going to be. I think a lot just depends on all the factors you mentioned. When do we get back, and to what degree do we get back, and how long does that cycle take? But if a doctor called either of you and said, hey, should I still go forward? Should I still move forward with transition planning? Or maybe a better question is, if I'm going to do it, how should I be prepared to approach it maybe differently, or what's the best guidance going forward?
I could start with that if you'd like. I'm dealing with that a lot. I mean, not just now. Now it's for different reasons with the COVID situation, but to go sit down with the client and say, what is your plan? What is your life plan even? Financially, how are you financially? Are you okay financially? You okay health-wise? Are you happy doing what you're doing? Is now the time you want to get rid of the administrative burdens of running a practice? And each doctor is a little different. That's what makes it fun. I mean, I'll sit down with doctors all the time and say, what's your 1-year plan, 2-year plan, 5-year plan? What do you want to do? And a lot of it's financial, like I said, some's health, some family issues, some want to move from Philadelphia to Florida or someplace, or Arizona, and the time to do it, or they just want to get rid of the headache of running a practice. So each one of them is a little bit different, and that's what makes it fun. But I don't think this necessarily has to change your planning if you said, I really do want to get out, depending what your reason was for wanting to get out. That doesn't mean you may or may not get a different price than you thought you would. And maybe your 401k is a little less than it was 3 months ago or 2 months ago. But that is maybe a function of then impacting the timing a little bit, but it may or may not impact what you really want to do. Starting the process early is the way to go. I think we've all seen, I know Bill and I have been involved with a couple, one in particular, that unfortunately the doctor waited too long, to really sell. And it's a tough situation because now it's a distressed sale. And when you get into that circumstance, that's tough on the family because a lot of times there's either no buyer or a distressed sale buyer coming in, or a much lesser price than they would have gotten if they had planned ahead for that. So every situation is different. I don't think someone who said 2 months ago, I want to retire in 6 months or 8 months, necessarily has to change that, other than maybe deferring the timing depending on its situation. So each one's different. That's what makes it fun.
Matt, how about you?
Yeah, boy, I think this, I'll get to the 6 month to 12 month seller here in a second, but even if you're 5 years out, it is not too early to plan for disruptions like this. It's not too early to plan for a transaction. This is a major asset disposition in your life. This is you transferring a legacy. I way too often see sellers wake up one day, decide that this is going to happen soon. I am burned out, ready to be done. And we rush through the process, and I can end up really injuring the transition of your legacy and sometimes injuring your bottom line of what you walk away with. So I think some planning does need to occur, even if you're 5 years out. I would encourage you to talk to people like Joe and Bill to plan that well and make sure that it happens as close as you can have it to your terms. But now specifically focusing on the people that are looking to, we're thinking at least to sell in the next 6 to 12 months. I'd say be more flexible than you thought you would be, not just from a dollar perspective, but from a terms perspective. If you want to try to transact in what we are in a very uncertain state of understanding the magnitude, the depth of a recession, if any, again, I have no idea. You can read 18 different articles, get 18 different answers on what life is going to look like after this. But what I would say is I do believe deals will still get done. If any lending is going to occur in the US of A, it's going to be dental. Again, the default rate, the economics behind your profession is just outstanding, even in bad times. So all that I will say is be a little bit more lenient on the terms and understand that probably some of it, if you want to get closer to a normal valuation in this uncertainty, you're going to have some holdback or some escrow. Just be very understanding that the buyer is going to look for some angles here to make sure that they're somewhat protected from the uncertainty. And I think that's a completely reasonable place for a buyer to be, and understanding that a seller, I've gotten a lot of calls from sellers that have gotten the taste of not going into the practice every day. And really, started thinking hard about the transitioning. I think that's a healthy thing. I would say that good planning, good team behind you is paramount in doing that well, and again, effectively transferring, rewarding you for what you built, but also transferring your legacy, which I think is a very undersold thing in this transaction world, is that you have built 30 to 40 years in these patients and your staff in this business, and I think it deserves the attention that a transaction of that magnitude should.
Can I kick in with something? If you're done, Matt, I don't want to cut you off. Another thing that's part of it, looking at it again from the seller's perspective, relates to a couple of things. One is, you don't want to get out and go from 100% to zero, meaning just walk away unless you have to. A lot of them would want to continue practicing for a while with the buyer, which helps the buyer hopefully retain some of what's been built by the seller over the years, and also helps in the transition, and hopefully keeps the doctor who sold the practice happy seeing patients, even if it's a day a week or some lesser time frame than he or she was used to working up to this point. Also gives him or her a chance to go back to the office, work with the staff, see some of the people they've developed a relationship with from a patient standpoint for the last few decades. So I think that's part of it. The other part that a lot of people, I think, make a mistake, and I get it, because a lot of people don't want to face up to, well, I'm ready to retire, is they wait too long. And like you said, Matt, and I implied earlier, 5 years is not too far ahead to be planning. Doesn't mean you have to say, I'm leaving the area in 5 years, but I want to make sure that I don't let the practice go downhill if I can help it, because you do have an asset. Your dental practice is an asset, and what the value of it is may change and go up and down a little bit here or there, but the one thing you want to do is not have that change because by what you did or didn't do. What I mean by that is staying in practice, cutting back time, cutting back volume and procedures and everything, and all of a sudden the practice that whatever today is worth whatever $1 million, by continuing to practice the next 5 years without planning and selling, maybe now it's worth $500,000 because the volume's dropped off. You haven't kept the office up to date. It looks old, whatever. And for those reasons, you basically have caused the value to drop by what you did or didn't do. And I'm not trying to be negative with that. It's more a planning thing to consider. And I know a lot of my clients have gone that route.
Yeah, no, I think there's a couple of themes there to pull out and kind of wrap this up that I think are important that both, Bill and you and Matt mentioned. I think in this time, if you are thinking about doing this, don't panic, right? Don't make a rash decision in this 4 to 6 to 8 week window. I'm not going to sell now, or I'm definitely going to sell now. I wasn't prepared to. I'm just going to get it on the market and see what happens. So I think, staying even keel is important. I think part of the way you do that is not probably in isolation. I think it's, and no pun intended since we're all isolated here, but I think the way you do that is you build yourself a team of professionals who can help you. And I think we're probably all biased on this call because we all advise people through this, but I think if you have an asset and you're going to dispose of it, it's going to be a big thing like Matt talked about, surround yourself with people who can give you some clear perspective on the market. People like Bill and I can say, hey, there's a lot of inventory out there. There's, the pricing pressures, out there at the buyer's market, or, we can give you some perspective on here's what's happening in your specific market. Here's what, is happening. So you can make an informed decision about, okay, and you can understand timing a little bit better. And you can talk to people like Matt and Bill and understand, the ins and outs of pricing and value and contingencies and legal aspects, so that when you decide to do it or to not do it, you're making that decision based on a team around you saying, you said you want to accomplish X, here's how to get to X, right? This is the timing. These are the things you need to have in place. These are the things you need to consider. And I think it's all the things you guys talked about. Bill, waiting a little bit too long. And Matt, to your point, we always tell people to start 5 years out with planning. That doesn't mean you're retiring. It doesn't mean you're selling anything, but it means you're starting to build a transition plan. And your transition plan and your transaction are two very different things. And the way you get to a good transaction is with a plan and being prepared. So I don't know if you guys have any other comments. I think this was very useful. We hit some of the high points and managed to keep it relatively brief and not send people into more long webinars and Zoom calls. Anything else to add, guys?
I think that's great, Joe. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate everybody's time. If you receive this video, all of our contact information came along with it. So please feel free to reach out to us directly if you have any questions and if we can help. So thanks again, and maybe we'll be back in a couple of weeks with an update. Take care.
Thank you.